Hello, it is just after 10 GMT. Let's begin with the worsening situation in Afghanistan. The United Nations Human Rights Chief has accused the Taliban of serious violations. Michelle Bachelet says there are credible reports of summary executions of civilians. Bachelet has urged the armed group to commit to the rights of women and ethnic and religious minorities. She's also called on the UN Human Rights Council to closely monitor the Taliban's actions.
We have also received credible reports of serious violation of international humanitarian law and human rights abuses taking place in many areas under effective Taliban control. They include, among others, summary executions of civilians and all the combat members of the Afghan National Security Forces, restrictions on the right of women, including the right to move around freely and girls' right to attend school. Afghanistan's diverse ethnic and religious minorities are also at risk of violence and repression.
The leaders of the G7 nations are scheduled to hold a virtual meeting to discuss the crisis later on Tuesday. Under pressure from allies, US President Joe Biden expected to decide on whether to keep American troops in Kabul beyond the August 31st deadline. But the Taliban has warned against any extension of that date. On the ground, more people are continuing to show up at Kabul airport, hoping to get out. Well, Charles Stratford is in Kabul with the latest on the evacuation efforts there. Nadim Barber is in London to tell us about that critical G7 meeting. But first, let's go live to Natasha Butler, who is in Paris for us. So, Natasha, we heard some very strong words at that meeting in Geneva of the UNHCR, didn't we?
Yes, we heard from the High Commissioner for Human Rights at this special session of the UN's Human Rights Council in Geneva, an emergency session called to really focus on the human rights situation in Afghanistan. As I said, opening speech by Michelle Bachelet, and she painted a very grim picture indeed of the human rights situation in Afghanistan. She said that her office has been inundated in the past days and weeks with reports of human rights abuses. She says that outside, for example, of the capital Kabul, in some of the remote areas, girls are being told that they can't go to school, women are being forced to stay at home. She talked about human rights defenders scared for their lives, trying to flee. So an incredibly grim picture was painted by Michelle Bachelet, who said that the Human Rights Council would call on the Taliban to adhere to international rules, international law, to uphold the rights of people in Afghanistan, women, girls, minorities, activists, people who've worked in the past for the media or for the former government. She also said that all violence must stop on all sides. We also heard during this council session that began a few hours ago in Geneva from Afghan delegates, the former Afghan ambassador to the UN, giving a very impassioned speech talking about the situation there, urging the international community to act, not to turn away, to actually put into place real actions on the ground, not just words, because the situation is so serious, not just now, but will continue to be so in the future.
A humanitarian crisis is unfolding as we speak. The people of Afghanistan, in particular, the thousands of human rights defenders, journalists, academics, professionals, civil society members, and former security personnel who were the backbone, and we hope still will be, of a contemporary and democratic society, and whose lives and livelihoods are at risk. They deserve your full support here at this council, at least your moral support.
To be frank with you, you are failing them. But now, today, not next month, not next March, you have the chance to redeem yourselves. Please take it. Please ensure the session has a credible and strong outcome. Please do not leave this tomorrow or the next month. Many I speak to you in Afghanistan already fear that they may not have a tomorrow. In our worst moments, we call on you to do better.
Well, delegates at the Human Rights Council are expected to adopt a resolution at the end of their meeting. But what some of the delegates, particularly those two Afghan speakers that you heard there, have been pushing for is a fact-finding mission, a UN fact-finding mission, which would mean that UN workers would be deployed in Afghanistan to document any abuses and hold those responsible accountable. It is something that international organisations, including Human Rights Watch, have been calling for over the past few days. So we'll have to wait and see whether or not that is part of the final resolution.
Natasha, thank you. Well, let's turn now to the latest developments inside Afghanistan. Now, Charles Stratford is live for us in Kabul. And Charles, the Taliban government slowly taking shape now. We're hearing of some new appointments.
Well, I think it's early to say that the Taliban government is taking shape. It's very important to note that this information is being put out by Reuters, and they're quoting a news agency called Pajwok, a local news agency. And these appointments, we understand, are acting appointments. They in no way reflect any, at this stage, potential future government. But according to the Pajwok news agency, quoted by Reuters, the Taliban have appointed a new acting finance minister, a man called Gul Akbar. He is what we understand was a famous military commander in Helmand province. It's also being reported that the Taliban have appointed an acting interior minister, a man called Sadr Ibrahim, again a famous commander who we've been told was very close to the former Taliban leader. And the acting intelligence chief apparently has also been appointed, a man called Butler, who at this stage we are making calls to confirm whether these appointments have indeed been made and to get more information, certainly about that, what's being reported as the acting intelligence chief. It's obviously important to recognise that the Taliban have been in consultations with the former president here, Hamid Karzai, and the former chief negotiator on behalf of Ashraf Ghani, Abdullah, in recent days, to try and flesh out the beginnings of negotiations for a formal government, a formal administration. We understand that those negotiations are ongoing. But when you speak to analysts here, the fundamental concerns that they have, along with human rights abuses and rule of law, are also financial ones. And it's interesting that an acting finance minister has reportedly been appointed today, because there are real concerns about whether the Taliban have the experience to run this country and to deal with the very great sort of financial needs and challenges that it faces.
A lot of discussion, Charles, about the ongoing evacuations. There's that G7 meeting coming up later today, and whether they will extend the deadline of August 31st for the US to get out completely. What's the latest we're hearing about the situation in Kabul airport right now?
Well, the evacuations continue. The Americans yesterday saying it was the greatest number of people had been evacuated in one day yesterday. They're also saying that up to 200 planes are involved in this effort. And as you say, we're getting closer by the day towards the August 31st deadline. We know there is pressure on Biden. We understand there is increasing pressure by other NATO members, that kind of pressure which we're expecting to see at this G7 summit later. The Taliban, as we know, have called August the 31st a red line, and they have warned of consequences. But let's remind ourselves that this deadline for the withdrawal of the US NATO forces from this country has already been changed twice, and the Taliban are looking for some sort of international legitimacy here, despite their rhetoric of saying this as being a red line and threatening consequences. It remains to be seen as to how forceful they would be when they are trying to be taken very seriously, as I say, by members of the international community. And they are in such dire need of money, and money that remains locked up, the US having frozen around $9 billion in US accounts, and that's Afghan cash.
Charles Stratford in Kabul, thank you. Well, Spain is warning it will have to leave people behind in Afghanistan, while Germany's foreign minister has suggested it may take longer to get people out beyond the end of August. It is the first NATO country to publicly say it is in talks to keep Kabul airport open for evacuations into September.
We're in talks with the US and Turkey in order to keep Kabul airport operational to make civil evacuations of these people possible. We will have a role to keep discussing that with the Taliban, and they're doing so because they will have to play a special role in that.
Well, let's talk now to Nadim Barber, who is live in London for us. So, Nadim, looks like the G7 leaders are divided on that extension of the deadline. What's likely to happen?
Well, Hazem, this virtual G7 meeting of the leaders of industrialised nations, that's the US, the UK, Canada, France, Germany, Italy and Japan, a meeting under the chairmanship of Prime Minister Boris Johnson, but it's also attended virtually by the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg and the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres. Beyond what happens right now in terms of evacuations, there are big questions that they're expected to talk about. The first is if and when to recognise the new Taliban administration in Kabul. The 2020 agreement signed by the Trump administration actually explicitly states that the Taliban is not recognised by the United States as a state. Beyond that, there are questions of whether, in fact, there should be renewed sanctions on the Taliban to pressure them to commit to their human rights commitments. We've been hearing what the UN Human Rights Chief has been saying about violations, reports of violations coming in already. So whether to try to pressure them to step up and meet those commitments and also commitments on international relations. But in the short term, yes, there is pressure on President Biden. The UK would like to keep its 1,000 or so military personnel in Kabul, keep the airlifts going. They would like a few more days beyond the deadline of next Tuesday, but Ben Wallace, the UK Defence Minister, in the last few hours has said that is unlikely and that the UK will not be able to do anything if the US does withdraw on that deadline. The shadow foreign secretary of the opposition Labour Party here in the UK is urging Boris Johnson not just to come up with a plan, not just to push President Biden on airlifts, but for a longer-term plan, including to help countries such as Pakistan, which have already received millions of Afghan refugees over the years and expected to receive more in the near future. She says that Boris Johnson can play a leadership role in trying to get the G7 nations to try to agree some sort of assistance plan for the region.
Nadim Barber, thank you. Now, the Taliban insists it will allow civilians to leave Afghanistan even after foreign forces withdraw. But many Afghans are sceptical and continue to arrive at Kabul airport hoping to get out. Charlotte Bellis reports from there.
Thousands of people at Kabul airport going nowhere. Beyond the gate are planes that US President Biden promised would take them away. But it's shut, so they jostle for position. The criteria: who is most threatened by the Taliban.
My mother has been inside the airport for the last 6 days, but the rest of our family is stuck outside because of all the people at the gate.
This is the North Gate where most people are asked to enter through, but in recent days it has been closed because of what the US says is security threats from ISIL. But for most people here, the biggest threat is a stampede, is dehydration and gunfire.
More than 20 people have been killed in the last week in and around the airport.
I'm living here with my children right now. I'm scared of the crowd and all the gunfire. There's no information. The US shouldn't have announced anything if they weren't able to take people out.
On the road to the North Gate, this is where the Taliban presence ends and Afghan special forces begin, specifically NDS 0 units. The two are separated by a piece of string. The 0 units ban filming, so we record on our phones. All other Afghan security forces surrendered, but they did not. 0 units are funded by the CIA and accused of night raids and human rights abuses.
There is a lot of danger here. The NDS 0 units, they're doing a lot of firing. They threaten people. A lot of people are wounded.
The US put them in charge of this stretch of road to separate Western forces from the Taliban. Still, as we filmed, the Taliban drove past unhindered. At the airport, gunfire has been the main cause of injuries. These were the Zero units last week. Shooting appears to be their preferred method of crowd control. The Taliban has also moved in some of its most feared fighters, the Badri 313. It is a special forces wing associated with the powerful Haqqani network. They are now securing the perimeter of the airport. People are trying to reach evacuation flights because they say they are scared of the Taliban. Yet it's the Taliban they must get through first, followed by Zero units in a lawless stretch of land. The US says it is flying out tens of thousands of people for their protection, but first making them cross a dangerous road to safety. Charlotte Bellis, Aljazeera, Kabul.